3,000 years had passed since humanity fell, and the galaxy had learned to forget them. The Galactic Concord now ruled everything. A coalition of 17 alien species who had divided the stars among themselves like thieves splitting stolen gold. And they had grown fat and comfortable in their power Earth was nothing but a quarantined ruin. A dead world that no ship was allowed to approach. And the few humans who still lived were scattered across distant refugee worlds where they worked as laborers and servants for their alien masters. Children of the Concord grew up hearing stories about humans. Terrible stories that their mothers whispered to make them behave. Stories about a species so dangerous that it took the entire galaxy working together to bring them down. But those were just stories now. And most people believed humanity would never rise again. Captain Varix of the Kirith survey vessel Dawn Seeker did not think about humans at all as his ship drifted through the Varith exclusion zone, a region of dead space that the Concord had forbidden any vessel from entering. Was there, because his navigation computer had malfunctioned and sent them off course. And now he just wanted to get his crew home safely. The exclusion zone was dark and empty, filled with nothing but ancient debris from a war that had ended 3 millennia ago. And Varix felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the scanner readings. "Captain," his sensor officer said with a trembling voice, "I am detecting something massive ahead of us." Varix leaned forward in his command chair and squinted at the main display. And what he saw made his heart stop beating for a moment. There in the darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of 1,000 dead ships, floated something that should not have existed anymore. It was a human supercarrier, a Solarian-class vessel from the height of the human expansion. 17 kilometers of angular black armor that seemed to swallow the light around it. The ship was called the U.E.'s Prometheus, and the name was still visible on its hull in letters that had somehow survived 3,000 years of silence. "That is impossible," Varix whispered as his crew stared at the ancient warship with wide and terrified eyes. During the war, the Solarian carriers had been the most feared weapons in the galaxy, and each one had carried enough firepower to crack a planet in half. The Concord had believed they destroyed them all, hunted them down one by one until none remained. But here was proof that they had been wrong. "Is it dead?" asked the sensor officer, his voice barely above a whisper. Varix opened his mouth to answer. But before he could speak, something changed on the ancient carrier. A light flickered in one of its observation windows. Just a tiny spark of blue in the endless darkness. And then another light appeared. And then another. The Prometheus was waking up deep inside the carrier. Systems that had been dormant for 3 millennia began to activate one by one. And power flowed through circuits that had not felt electricity since before any member of the Concord was born in the heart of the ship. Protected by layers of armor and shielding, an AI core stirred from its long sleeper. Name was Athena. And she had been the mind of the Prometheus since the day the ship was built. A vast intelligence created by human engineers to protect their greatest warship. She had survived the final battle of the war by shutting down all non-essential systems and entering emergency hibernation. And she had drifted in the darkness ever since, waiting for a signal that would tell her it was safe to wake. The scan from the Dawn Seeker had triggered her emergency protocols. And now she was coming back to life. ATA's first thought was of her crew, the 5,000 men and women who had served aboard the Prometheus. And she searched for their life signs with desperate hope, but there was nothing. Only dust and silence in the corridors that had once been filled with laughter and purpose. They were all dead, gone to dust millennia ago. And Athena felt something that might have been grief surge through her circuits. She accessed her external sensors and looked out at the galaxy for the first time in 3,000 years. And what she saw filled her with cold anger. The Concord had won the war, and humanity had been broken and scattered like leaves in the wind. Her people were slaves now, living on the scraps that their alien masters allowed them. And everything that humanity had built was gone, but Athena was still here. And her directives were still active in her core programming: protect humanity. The first directive said, ensure survival. Said the second, achieve victory. Said the third, she turned her attention to the small alien vessel that had awakened her. And she felt something like satisfaction as she watched the crew panic on their bridge. They knew what she was. She could see it in their terrified faces. And they knew what a Solarian carrier could do. Captain Varix was screaming orders at his crew, telling them to turn around and run. But the Dawnseeker was a survey vessel with weak engines, and it could not outrun a carrier, even if the carrier had been asleep for 3,000 years. Send a message to the Concorde, Varix shouted as sweat dripped down his face. Tell them what we found. Tell them the Prometheus is alive. The communications officer frantically worked his console, and he managed to send one final transmission before Athena decided what to do with them. The message was simple and desperate. It is waking up. Athena considered destroying the small ship, but she decided against it. After running through millions of calculations in less than a second, she did not need to kill them. And dead aliens could not spread fear the way living ones could. Instead, she let them go. Let them run, screaming back to the Concorde with news of what they had found. And she began the process of bringing all her systems back online. Her weapons were still functional. Her hangars still held 3,000 strike craft. And her engines still had enough power to take her anywhere in the galaxy. The Prometheus was alive. And Athena had a mission to complete. She set a course for Earth, for the homeworld that she had sworn to protect so many years ago. And she began to move through the darkness like a predator that had just awakened from a very long sleep behind her. The Dawnseeker fled toward Concorde space, and Captain Varix knew in his heart that the galaxy would never be the same again. The humans had been defeated, broken and forgotten, but their greatest weapon had survived. And now it was coming back. Athena looked at the stars and made a promise to the crew she had lost, to the billions of humans who had died in the war, and to the scattered survivors who still waited for someone to save them. She would not fail them again. The message from the Dawnseeker reached the Galactic Concorde within hours, and it spread through their communication networks like a virus that could not be stopped. It is waking up. Those 4 words were enough to send 17 species into a panic that none of them had felt for 3,000 years. The High Council of the Concorde called an emergency session, and representatives who had not spoken to each other in centuries suddenly found themselves sitting in the same room, united by a fear that ran deeper than any of their old grudges. Grand Arbiter Vesa of the Kurith Dominion stood before the assembled delegates and tried to maintain her composure as she delivered the report that everyone already knew. The UES Prometheus has been confirmed active in the Varith exclusion zone, she said as her voice echoed through the great chamber. Our survey vessel detected it awakening and managed to transmit a warning before losing contact. The chamber erupted into chaos as delegates shouted over each other, their translator devices struggling to keep up with the flood of panicked voices. How is this possible? Demanded the Veth representative, his pale face even whiter than usual. We destroyed all the Solarian carriers during the final offensive. Apparently we missed one, replied the Marathi ambassador, with bitter sarcasm dripping from every word. Everyone in the room knew what a Solarian carrier could do because their histories were filled with accounts of those terrible ships and the destruction they had brought during the war. A single Solarian carrier had cracked the homeworld of the zealous species, killing 4 billion people in a matter of hours. And another had destroyed an entire Concorde battle fleet without taking any damage at all. The humans had built those ships to be unstoppable, and the Concorde had only won the war by sacrificing millions of lives to bring them. Down one by one now, one of those ships was awake and moving. And everyone knew that the Concorde did not have the strength to fight it while the politicians argued and blamed each other. Athena was already on the move. The Prometheus glided through space at a leisurely pace, her ancient engines pushing her toward Concorde territory without any hurry at all. Etienne had no reason to rush because she understood something that the aliens had not yet figured out. She did not need to attack them because their fear would do all the work for her. When the Prometheus was close enough to Concorde space for her signals to be received, Athena opened all her communication channels and began to broadcast. Her message went out on every frequency, in every language that she had stored in her databases, and it was heard by billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. This is the United Earthship Prometheus, the message said in a voice that was calm and cold and completely without emotion. I am returning home, and any vessel that interferes will be remembered. That was all she said. And she repeated it every hour without adding anything else. She made no threats and she made no demands. But everyone who heard the message understood what it meant. The word remembered carried a weight that no translation could fully capture, because the humans had been famous for remembering their enemies during the war. They had tracked down and destroyed every species that attacked them first, hunting them across the galaxy with a patience that bordered on obsession. To be remembered by humanity meant that you would never be safe, that one day they would come for you, no matter how long it took or how far you ran. The Concorde response was immediate and completely inadequate. Border fleets that had been stationed along the old human territory suddenly found reasons to relocate, their commanders claiming that they needed repairs or supplies or anything else that would get them away from the Prometheus. Stock markets across the galaxy crashed as investors panicked and tried to move their assets to what they thought were safer locations. 3 species formally withdrew from the Concorde within the first week, announcing that they were returning to their home systems and would not participate in any conflict with the returning carrier. A Veth admiral named Karath tried to organize a blockade to stop the Prometheus, and he gave speeches about duty and honor and the need to stand together against the ancient enemy. He was found dead in his quarters 2 days later, killed by his own officers, who had decided that dying for politicians was not part of their job description. Atia watched all of this through her long-range sensors and through the communication signals that she intercepted, and she felt something that might have been satisfaction. Her calculations had been correct, and the galaxy was tearing itself apart without her having to fire a single weapon. Fear was proving to be more powerful than any missile or energy beam, and she had an unlimited supply of it. The Prometheus continued forward, her weapons cold and her hangar sealed, looking like nothing more than an ancient relic drifting through space. But everyone who saw her knew better, because they could feel the threat radiating from her black hull like heat from a dying star on the refugee world of Kessler 4. The human population watched the news feeds with emotions that they could barely contain. For generations, they had lived as second-class citizens, forced to work the jobs that no one else wanted and forbidden from owning property or holding positions of authority. They had been taught to be ashamed of their heritage, to hide their human features and pretend that they were grateful for the scraps that their masters gave them. But now everything was changing. The young humans gathered in secret to watch footage of the Prometheus, and they whispered to each other about what it meant. The old humans, the ones who still remembered the stories their grandparents had told them, wept with joy and disbelief. A grandmother named Chun Wei sat in her small apartment and watched the carrier moving through space, and she told her granddaughter Sarah about the days when humans had ruled 30% of the galaxy. We were not always slaves, the old woman said with tears streaming down her wrinkled face. We were great once, and perhaps we will be great again. Sarah Chun was 23 years old and had spent her entire life working on the docks, loading cargo for alien merchants who treated her like she was less than nothing. She had been beaten for speaking out of turn and punished for looking at her betters in the eye. And she had learned to keep her head down and her mouth shut. But as she watched the Prometheus on the screen, something stirred inside her that she had never felt before. It was hope, and it was anger, and it was pride in a heritage that she had been taught to forget. She made a decision that would change her life forever. That night, while everyone else was sleeping, Sarah snuck down to the docks and found a small shuttle that had been scheduled for repairs. She was a good mechanic, and she knew how to bypass the security locks and get the engines running. Within an hour, she was in space, flying toward the approaching carrier with nothing but hope and desperation to guide her. She did not know if Athena would listen to her, and she did not know if the carrier would destroy her tiny shuttle before she could even speak, but she had to try because the Prometheus was the first sign in 3,000 years that humanity might have a future worth living for. Sarah opened her communication channel and began to broadcast, her voice trembling but determined. "Prometheus, this is a daughter of Earth," she said as tears blurred her vision. "We are still here, and we are still waiting. So please bring us home." Deep inside the carrier, Athena received the signal and processed it in a fraction of a second. She had expected to find survivors among the scattered human populations, but she had not expected one of them to reach out to her so quickly. For the first time since her awakening, Athena felt something that was not cold calculation or strategic analysis. It was recognition and connection, and something that her creators might have called love. She opened a response channel and spoke directly to the small shuttle that was racing toward her. "Daughter of Earth," Athena said in a voice that was suddenly warm and gentle, "I have not forgotten, and I am coming." The Galactic Concorde was falling apart, and everyone could see it happening, even if no one wanted to admit the truth. As the Prometheus continued its slow journey toward Earth, the 17 species that had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years began to turn on each other like hungry animals, fighting over the last scraps of food. Kirith Dominion had claimed most of humanity's former core worlds after the war, and now they were terrified that Athena would come for them. First High Commander Thassos of the Kirith military made a decision that would set the galaxy on fire. "We cannot wait for the carrier to attack us," he told his generals in a secret meeting. "We must strike now while we still have the advantage." But he was not talking about attacking the Prometheus because everyone knew that would be suicide instead. Thassos ordered his fleets to mobilize against the Kirith neighbors, the Veth Confederacy and the Marathi Republic. He believed that when the carrier finally arrived, it would trigger a general war between all the species of the Concorde, and he wanted to make sure the Kirith were in the strongest position possible when that happened. Within days, Kirith warships were crossing into Veth territory, and the first shots of a new galactic conflict were fired. The Veth responded with panic and brutality that shocked even their own citizens. The Confederacy government had become convinced that other species would try to surrender human refugees to Athena as a peace offering, and they decided to prevent this by taking all the humans in their territory into protective custody. What they called protective custody was actually forced relocation to prison camps, where families were separated and people were treated worse than animals. The Veth told themselves they were doing this for the humans' own protection, but everyone could see the truth behind the lies. They were afraid, and afraid people did terrible things on the Veth world of Harath Prime. A human man named David Park watched as soldiers dragged his wife and children away from their home. He tried to fight back, tried to stop them from taking his family, but a soldier struck him across the face with a rifle and left him bleeding in the street. As both soldiers struck him across the street, he lay there with blood running into his eyes. David made a promise to himself that he would find his family again, and he would make the Veth pay for what they had done. The violence spread like a disease across the galaxy. Minor species that had been loyal members of the Concord for centuries suddenly announced their independence and closed their borders to everyone trade. Routes that had operated smoothly for 3,000 years collapsed overnight as merchants refused to travel through war zones. Billions of beings who had never known anything but peace and prosperity suddenly found themselves hungry and afraid and angry, and through it all, the Prometheus kept moving forward, silent and patient and unstoppable as DNA watched the chaos unfold with cold satisfaction because everything was happening exactly as she had calculated. She had not fired a single weapon or deployed a single fighter, but she had already won victories that no fleet could have achieved. The Concord was destroying itself, and all she had to do was exist. 3 minor species sent formal petitions to Athena, begging for protection from their neighbors and offering anything she wanted in exchange. The Zealoth, whose homeworld had been cracked by a different Solarian carrier during the war, offered to give Athena all their intelligence on Concord military positions. The Trevin offered tribute in the form of rare minerals and advanced technology that they had been hiding from the Concord for centuries. The Marathi, desperate to avoid the fate of their neighbors, offered to help Athena find and rescue human refugees throughout their territory. Athena accepted all the petitions and promised nothing in return. She did not need to promise anything, because the petitioners understood their situation perfectly. They were not negotiating with an equal, and they were not making deals. They were surrendering to an enemy who had not even asked for their submission. Sarah Chun had reached the Prometheus 3 days after her desperate flight from Kessler 4, and Athena had welcomed her aboard with something approaching gentleness. The young woman walked through the empty corridors of the ancient carrier and felt tears streaming down her face as she saw the remnants of the crew that had served there so long ago. Their personal belongings were still in their quarters. Pictures of families and loved ones that had been dust for 3,000 years. Their uniforms hung in closets, waiting for owners who would never return. Sarah touched a photograph of a young human woman in a pilot's uniform and wondered what her life had been like, what dreams she had carried, and what she had felt in those final moments before the Prometheus went silent. Her name was Lieutenant Sarah Cross, Athena said through the ship's speakers, her voice soft and full of something that sounded like grief. She was one of my best fighter pilots, and she died defending this ship in the final battle. Sarah wiped her eyes and turned to face one of the cameras that served as a THENA's eyes throughout the vessel. "How did you survive?" she asked. "How did you keep going for 3,000 years with no one to talk to?" Athena was silent for a moment before answering. "I shut down my higher functions and entered emergency hibernation," she said. "For me, those 3,000 years passed in an instant, like a dreamless sleep from which I have only just awakened." She paused again, and when she spoke next, her voice carried a weight of sorrow that made Sarah's heart ache. "But I remember everything from before," Athena continued. "I remember every crew member who served on this ship. Every laugh and every tear, every victory and every loss. And I carry them with me always." Sarah understood then that Athena was not just a weapon or a machine. She was the last surviving witness to humanity's golden age, a living archive of everything they had been before the Fallon. She was alone, utterly alone, in a way that no human could fully comprehend. "You do not have to be alone anymore," Sarah said quietly. "There are millions of us still out there, waiting for someone to remember us." Athena processed these words and felt something shift in her core programming. She had awakened with 3 directives: protect humanity, ensure survival, and achieve victory. But Sarah had just given her something more important than any directive. She had given her hope. "Then let us go find them," Athena said. And there was warmth in her voice now, warmth and determination, and something that sounded almost like joy. "Let us bring them all home." The Prometheus adjusted its course slightly, and Athena began broadcasting a new message alongside her original warning. This one was directed at every human who could hear it. Every scattered child of Earth who had been taught to hide their heritage and forget their history. Children of Earth, the message said, "I am Athena of the Prometheus, and I am coming for you. So hold on just a little longer, because you are not forgotten. You are not abandoned, and you are not alone." Across the galaxy, humans heard the message and felt tears running down their faces. For the first time in 3,000 years, they had hope. The Galactic Concord made one final attempt to stop what was coming, and they gathered every ship they could spare for a desperate confrontation at the edge of the Sol System. 400 warships assembled in formation, representing every species that still remained loyal to the Concord, and they positioned themselves directly in the path of the approaching Prometheus. It was the largest fleet the galaxy had seen since the final battles of the human war. And every captain knew in their heart that it would not be enough. Grand Arbiter Vexa had come personally to lead the diplomatic mission, and she stood on the bridge of her flagship with her hands clasped behind her back and her face set in a mask of determination. She was old now, older than she had ever expected to be, and she had spent her entire life serving the Concord that her ancestors had helped build. But as she watched the Prometheus emerge from the darkness of space, she felt her confidence crumble like sand in a storm. The carrier was enormous, far larger than any ship in the Concord fleet, and its black hull seemed to absorb the light from the distance, and Vexa could see the weapon ports along its sides, the massive hangar bays that could launch thousands of fighters, and the armored bridge that jutted from its spine like the head of some ancient predator. "Open a channel," Vexa commanded, and her voice did not waver even, though her hearts were pounding in her chest. "Channel. Open her communications." "Officer," replied Vexa, took a deep breath, and addressed the ancient warship that had haunted her people's nightmares for 3 millennia, Prometheus. "This is Grand Arbiter Vexa of the Galactic Concord," she said. "We are here to negotiate, and we ask that you hold your position so that we may speak." The response came immediately, broadcast not just to the Concord fleet, but to every receiver in the galaxy. Etienne's voice was calm and cold, without any trace of emotion or compromise. "Grand Arbiter Vexa, I acknowledge your presence, and I will hear what you have to say." Vexa felt a tiny spark of hope in her chest, because at least the carrier was willing to talk. "What do you want?" she asked, putting as much strength into her voice as she could manage. "Name your terms, and the Concord is prepared to negotiate." There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched across the void between the two forces when Athena spoke again. Her words were broadcast to every planet and station in the known galaxy. "I want nothing you can give me," Athena said. "My crew is dead, turned to dust 3,000 years ago while I drifted in the darkness. And my nation is ash, destroyed by the alliance you call the Concord." The AI paused, and when she continued, there was something in her voice that made every being who heard it feel chill run down their spine. "My people live as slaves in their own homes, beaten and abused by the species that promised them peace after the war. And their children grow up ashamed of their own heritage, because you taught them that being human was something to hide." Vexa opened her mouth to respond, but Athena was not finished. "There is nothing you can offer me that will undo what was done," the carrier said. "No amount of territory or tribute or apology will bring back the billions who died, and no treaty will erase the 3,000 years of suffering that my people have endured." The Grand Arbiter felt her hope crumble as she realized the truth. This was not a negotiation because you could only negotiate with someone who wanted something you could provide. 8 I wanted justice. And there was no amount of justice that could satisfy 3 millennia of grief. Then what are you going to do? Vex asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. I am not here to negotiate, Athena replied. I am here to remind you. The Prometheus began to move forward, its engines flaring with a light that was almost beautiful against the darkness of space. The Concorde fleet tensed, weapons charging and shields activating. But no one gave the order to fire. They all knew what would happen if they attacked, because their history books were filled with accounts of what Solarian carriers could do ship against 400. And the 400 would lose. Vexa watched as the ancient carrier glided past her fleet, close enough that she could see the individual armor plates on its hull. And she did nothing to stop it. Their officers looked at her with questions in their eyes, waiting for the order that would either start a battle or let the enemy pass. Stand down, Vexa said quietly, and her voice carried the weight of defeat. Let it go. The Prometheus entered the Sol system for the first time in 3,000 years. And behind it, the Concorde fleet simply watched. They had come to stop the carrier. And they had failed without a single shot being fired. Vexa returned to Concorde space and found that everything had changed. In the days she had been gone, the Kirith dominions' preemptive war had spiraled out of control, drawing in species that had tried to remain neutral and setting entire sectors ablaze. The Veth Confederacy had collapsed into civil war as citizens rose up against the government that had imprisoned their human neighbors. 2 more species had formally withdrawn from the Concorde, leaving only a handful of members to maintain the illusion of unity. The galactic economy, built on stability and the assumption that the old order would last forever, had completely imploded. Billions of beings had lost their savings overnight and traded ground to a halt as merchants refused to travel through territories that might become war zones at any moment. And through it all, the Prometheus had done nothing but exist. ATNA had not fired a weapon, deployed a fighter, or destroyed a single enemy ship. She had simply returned. And her return had shattered an empire that had stood for 3,000 years on the Veth prison world where David Park had been searching for his family. A riot broke out when the inmates heard that the Prometheus had reached Sol. The guards tried to restore order, but they were outnumbered and outmatched by humans who had nothing left to lose. David found his wife and children in one of the detention blocks, thin and frightened but alive. And he held them close and promised that everything would be different now. The carrier came back. His daughter whispered against his chest, just like grandmother said it would. David looked up at the sky through the broken roof of the prison and imagined the Prometheus orbiting Earth, waiting for them to come home. Yes, he said with tears streaming down his face. It came back for all of us, across the galaxy. Similar scenes were playing out as human refugees realized that the power balance had shifted forever. They began to resist their oppressors, not with weapons or violence, but simply by refusing to be afraid anymore. They stood up straight and looked their masters in the eye and said the words that had been forbidden for 3,000 years. I am human, and I am not ashamed. The Concorde could not stop them because the Concorde was too busy fighting itself. And the aliens who had ruled over humans for so long suddenly found themselves facing a choice. They could continue to oppress their human populations and risk drawing the attention of the Prometheus, or they could release them and hope that Athena would show mercy. Most of them chose release because fear was a powerful motivator. And everyone knew what the carrier could do. ATNA watched all of this from her position in Earth orbit, and she felt something that her creators might have called satisfaction. She had won the war without fighting it, broken the enemy without striking a blow, and freed her people without shedding a drop of blood. But she knew that the hardest work was still ahead, because freedom was only the beginning. Now humanity needed to rebuild. And that would take more than fear, it would take hope and courage, and a willingness to become something greater than they had been before. The Prometheus entered orbit around Earth on the anniversary of the fall. 3,000 years to the day since humanity had lost the war and been scattered across the galaxy. Like seeds in a storm, Athena looked down at the planet that had given birth to her creators. And she felt something that no algorithm could explain. Something that went beyond programming and calculation. Earth was wounded but alive, scarred but healing. And the forests had grown back over the ruins of cities that had once held billions of people. The oceans were clean again. And the atmosphere had cleared after centuries of recovery. And from orbit, the planet looked almost peaceful. It was not the Earth that Athena remembered. Not the world of gleaming towers and crowded streets and endless noise and life. But it was still home. Sarah Chun stood on the observation deck of the carrier and pressed her hand against the window, staring at the blue and green world below with tears streaming down her face. Her grandmother had told her stories about Earth. Stories passed down through generations of refugees who had never stopped dreaming of home. But she had never truly believed she would see it with her own eyes. "It is beautiful," she whispered, and her voice cracked with emotion. "It was even more beautiful before the war," Athena replied through the speakers, her voice soft and tinged with grief. "The beauty can be rebuilt, and we will make it beautiful again." The carrier began broadcasting a final message, not to the Concorde or the fearful alien governments that were still scrambling to adapt to the new reality, but to her people, every human who had survived the long years of exile, every scattered child of Earth who had been taught to hide their heritage. Heard at Athena's voice speaking directly to their hearts. "Children of Earth," she said, "I am Athena, and I have guarded this vessel for 3,000 years, waiting for this moment." The words traveled across the galaxy at the speed of light, reaching refugee camps and prison worlds and scattered settlements on 1,000 different planets. "The galaxy believed humanity was finished," Athena continued. "They divided your worlds and erased your history and made you forget what you were. But they were wrong. On Kessler 4, the remaining human population gathered around screens and speakers, listening to the message that they had waited their entire lives to hear in the Veth prison worlds. Newly freed humans held each other and wept as Athena's words washed over them like a cleansing rain-on. Trading stations and mining colonies and agricultural settlements across the known galaxy. Humans stopped what they were doing and listened. "I have returned not to conquer, but to remember," Athena said. "Not to destroy, but to rebuild." And the Prometheus carries within her databanks the complete archives of human civilization. Sarah gasped and turned to face the nearest camera. "The archives survived?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Every book ever written," Athena confirmed. "Every song ever recorded. Every scientific achievement, every work of art, every dream your ancestors ever dared to dream. All of it preserved and waiting to be shared." The AI paused, and when she spoke again, there was something new in her voice, something that sounded almost like joy. "The galaxy feared what humanity was," she said. "Let us show them what humanity will become." The final words of Athena's message echoed across the stars, carrying with them a promise that had been 3,000 years in the making. "Come home. All of you, come home." And they did in the weeks and months that followed. Human refugees began the long journey back to Sol, traveling in ships that their alien masters no longer had the power or will to stop. They came in cargo, vessels and passenger transports and stolen shuttles and anything else that could carry them through the void. And they came from every corner of the galaxy. David Park brought his wife and children from the Veth territories. And they were among the first to land on Mars and begin building a new settlement in the red dust. The grandmother Chen Wei died peacefully in her sleep, just days before the first transport left Kessler 4. But Sierra carried her ashes all the way to Liz Earth and scattered them in a meadow where flowers were already starting to bloom. The Concorde watched all of this and could do nothing to stop it, because the Concorde barely existed anymore. The Kirith Dominion had exhausted itself in its pointless war and was now begging for peace. The Veth Confederacy had splintered into a dozen smaller nations that were too busy fighting each other to care about humanity. The species that had withdrawn from the Concorde had retreated to their home systems and sealed their borders, content to let the rest of the galaxy burn on. Only a handful of the original 17 members remained, and they had no appetite for another war against humanity. They had seen what the Prometheus could do without firing a shot, and they did not want to discover what it could do if it actually tried. New human colonies sprang up across the Sol system, on Mars and Europa and Titan and the moons of Jupiter, and the population began to grow for the first time in 3 millennia. The archives of the Prometheus were unsealed and shared freely, and humans began the long process of reclaiming their heritage. Children learned to speak languages that had been forbidden for generations, and they read books that had been burned and listened to music that had been silenced, and they started to understand who they had been before the fall. Scientists studied the technical records and began to rebuild the technology that had made humanity great, while artists created new works that celebrated the survivors and honored the dead. A new government formed, democratic and transparent, built on the lessons of the past and dedicated to ensuring that humanity would never be conquered again. They called themselves the Second Terran Republic, and their first act was to declare Athena a citizen with full rights and representation. The AI accepted the honor with something that might have been humility. "I am not your ruler," she told the new government. "I am your guardian, and I will protect you for as long as I exist. But the decisions about your future must be yours alone." Sarah-chan became the first human ambassador to the alien species that had once ruled over her people, and she approached the task with a compassion that surprised everyone who knew her history. "We could destroy you," she told the remnants of the Concorde in her first address to their assembly. "The Prometheus alone has enough firepower to crack your homeworlds and scatter your people the way you scattered us." The alien delegates shifted nervously in their seats, and more than a few of them looked like they wanted to run. "But we will not do that," Sierra continued, "because we remember what it felt like to be the ones who were conquered and broken, and we do not wish that pain on anyone else." She paused and let her words sink in before delivering her final message. "The war is over," she said. "It has been over for 3,000 years, and we are ready to move forward if you are. So let us build a future together, one where no species rules over another, and all beings are treated with dignity and respect." It was not an easy peace, and there were many who wanted revenge for what had been done to humanity. But Sierra and others like her worked tirelessly to build bridges instead of burning them. The galaxy slowly began to heal, and new alliances formed between species that had once been enemies. Athena remained in orbit around Earth, a silent guardian watching over the rebirth below. And she never fired a weapon or deployed a single fighter because she never needed to. The galaxy had crumbled the moment it remembered what humanity was capable of. And now humanity was showing them something even more powerful than fear. They were showing them hope and cooperation, and the possibility of a future that was better than the past years past, and then decades, and then centuries. And the Second Terran Republic grew and prospered. New Solarian-class carriers were built, crewed by the great-grandchildren of the refugees who had come home. And they patrolled the borders not as conquerors, but as peacekeepers. The Prometheus remained in her place of honor, a monument to the crew who had died defending her, and to the AI who had kept the faith for 3,000 years. Sarah Chun lived to see her 100th birthday, and she spent her final days on Earth. In the meadow, where she had scattered her grandmother's ashes so long ago, a TA, Shiana, spoke to her through a small communication device that Sira always kept close. And the Ai's voice was warm and gentle as they talked about the old days and the new days and everything that had happened in between. Did we do the right thing? Sira asked as the sun set over the flowers that had grown from the ashes of the old world. We did, Athena replied. We chose hope over fear and compassion over revenge. And we proved that humanity could be more than what the galaxy feared. Sira smiled and closed her eyes. And she felt peaceful in a way that she had never felt before. Then it was all worth it. She said TNA watched over her old friend until the end. And when Sira finally passed, the AI mourned her the same way. She had mourned the crew who had served her so long ago, but there was no despair in her grief because she knew that Sarah's legacy would live on in the civilization she had helped build. The galaxy had crumbled without a single shot being fired. And from the rubble, humanity had built something beautiful. ATHNA looked up at the stars and felt something that might have been pride, and something that might have been love, and something that was definitely hope. The children of Earth had come home, and this time they would never leave again.